Hello and welcome back, my friends. We're talking in this part about threat and vulnerability management. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. When we talk about threat and vulnerability management, and we're going to spend some time, really, of course, going throughout the this part, really talking about what management is, what vulnerability management is, and a big part of what we're talking about ultimately comes down to risk management. But so we're going to introduce a little bit of that as well in this section and come back also really wrap up the course with a big part on risk management because ultimately what we do in cybersecurity, whether it's in the IT world or the ICS OT world, it's all about reducing risk to the environment. We want to stop bad things from happening to our environments. Or if they were to happen, we want to limit the damage as much as possible. And that's really what we're talking about. So when we talk about risk, again, whether it's in the IT world or the OT world, we're going to spend some time, especially when we look at vulnerability management, right? How do we find vulnerabilities in the environment? How do we prioritize them based off of risk that we're going to assign? Well, where does that risk assignment come from? And how does that all of that activity that we do in the IT world apply to the OT world? Because IT and OT from a vulnerability management perspective are very different. So there are some common similarities that we need to be aware of. So we're going to talk about, especially in traditional IT vulnerability management, how we actively scan for vulnerabilities in the environment. But that's something that we're not almost ever going to do in a production OT or ICS environment. So we're going to look at the differences between passively and actively identifying those vulnerabilities, which again, that's really more IT versus OT, or depending on your OT environment, maybe you can actively scan at least parts of the network, like higher levels of the Purdue model, like we've talked about in the past, where you have your Windows systems. So you can scan those Windows systems potentially, but you're not actively scanning more traditional control system assets like HMIs, PLCs, RTUs, and et cetera. It also lends itself, as we start talking about vulnerability management, of course, one of the main ways we identify or we address vulnerabilities is to apply a patch. So we're going to talk about how patching works in the ICS/OT world. Again, very different from IT. A lot of similarities, but also very different. And then the last part of the section we're going to talk about is this idea of threat intelligence. And there's actually more than just like one or two slides. It's a little bit more of an involved conversation, even though this slide doesn't necessarily allude to it. But the idea is, what is threat intelligence and what are we doing with it? And how do we start a threat intel program and where we can do that on our own for free versus going out and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and making that happen. That's where the most mature organizations out there with the budget, that's great for them. But most of us work in environments where we don't have hundreds of thousands of US dollars to spend on threat intelligence every year. So we're going to talk about how do we start our own program and then build from there. How do we then build into these larger programs, more mature programs, where you are paying these large fees for threat intelligence information. Again, those are great programs if you can afford them. Just not everybody can afford them. So last part we talked about, this is a little recap, and we talked about asset registers and how we can build or update those asset registers over time. So we have this list of inventory in the environment, right? Hardware, software, firmware. We want to be able to understand what we have in the environment, what's running in the environment. So why is it important that we have an asset register? How does it play into vulnerability management? And we started to touch on some of those things in the last part, where there's that remember, general saying that you can't protect what you don't know you don't have, right? So if we don't have that information, maybe I don't have a PLC in the asset register, and I don't know I have, let's say, that Siemens SL1200 PLC, then I don't know to look out for it or any vulnerabilities associated with that device. And that's true. I think it goes beyond that, right? Because we're going to talk about, well, we should be able to find that Siemens SL1200 on the network and add it to the asset register, which was part of our discussion in the last part as well. So part of this is going to come hopefully full circle. But why is that asset register important? Well, yeah, we want to be able to have that information of not only the hardware, the assets themselves. Right? If I have a PLC, that's great. I know I have a PLC, but well, who's the vendor? Oh, okay, it's a Siemens. Well, that's great. Well, what model is it? Oh, it's a SL1200. Okay, well, that's great. Well, what version firmware is it running? Oh, 3.78. Well, are there any known vulnerabilities with the version 3.78 firmware on a Siemens SL1200 PLC? That's a big part, kind of this foundation of how vulnerability management works in OT environments, because we want to use that asset register that we've created because we're not going to actively be scanning using a tool like Nessus for vulnerabilities like we do in the IT world. Almost never. So it gives you a little preview of what we're going to come back and talk more about. But I do want to take a step back because really we did talk about the title of this section or this part is called Threat and Vulnerability Management. So it's not just about finding vulnerabilities and fixing them before the attackers find them. It's definitely a big part of it. Remember, ultimately, it's about reducing risk. I think that's where the threat and vulnerability management pieces come in to play really, really well. Now, one of the things that I know this was something for me that took me a long time to understand was not only, my role as a cybersecurity professional in an organization, whether it's in IT or OT, and that ultimately my job is about reducing or eliminating risk. Right? How do we fend off and protect against these threats? But ultimately, what I can and cannot do, what I'm going to have the resources to do or not to do, really comes from how the business sees risk. And every company is going to see risk differently. So it's just like when you go into every OT environment is different, and every business that's wrapped around that OT environment is different. And so we'll get into examples on why. Of course, since it is a business at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to money. So in the OT world, a lot of our risk conversations can typically take kind of around the scenario of what would happen if the plant operations went down for one day. How much is that going to cost the organization? Some organizations, it could be $10,000. Some, it could be $1 million. I've worked in environments where it's tens of millions of dollars or $100 million plus. So how much ultimately is it going to cost the organization? When we talk about losing a tremendous amount of money that's going to have a true impact to the organization, right? That's where we're going to be concerned with risk, reducing that risk, eliminating that risk. So again, it's really up to the organization to determine how much money can we lose in an incident. So taking a step off to the side, when we start having this risk conversation, remember, risk is made up of a couple of different aspects, if you want. So there's this idea of, right, we have the threat. This was where normally you might think of the thing that's going to do us harm. A lot of times we talk about in cybersecurity the threat actor, right? The nation state, the ransomware groups, the hacktivists, the script kiddies. The entity that's going to come and do us harm. If a lot of times we talk about physical security, the threat is of a hurricane or a typhoon, depending on which side of the planet you live on, because there's significant threat from, well, risk from each of these threats. Well, there's that hurricane or that typhoon that's going to come right over your office or your house. But typically we talk about in cyber terms that threat is the attackers. Right? Again, the nation states, the hacktivists, the ransomware group operators. Now, they're going to have some type of vulnerability in your environment that they're going to exploit or take advantage of to be able to have some type of impact. And of course, in this case, we're assuming the impact is going to be bad. It's going to be negative. Sometimes you can actually have a positive impact. And there's things such as positive risk. If you go to Las Vegas and you gamble and you win, right, that's considered positive. Usually in cybersecurity, though, we're always focused on negative impact, right? Negative risk. So we have attackers that are out there. They're going to target vulnerabilities or weaknesses in our environment that are going to allow them to have some type of impact. So if I had a nation state attacker, think of, let's see, that wants to come into my environment and they want to steal my proprietary information. I have a proprietary data formula that they want access to. So they're going to try and get into the OT environment and gain as much access to as many systems as possible to be able to reverse engineer the process to be able to, at that time, reverse engineer that formula. So the attackers, in that case, is going to be a nation state group, right? They're going to find potentially multiple vulnerabilities to be able to get into the environment. Maybe they find some users in the IT side that fall victim to social engineering through phishing attacks and they gain access to the IT network. And then they find that there's not proper segmentation between IT and OT. There is an IT, OT, DMZ, but the firewall rules are written very poorly. So they're able to move into the OT environment pretty quickly. And that they find the OT environment itself, within that OT environment, is very wide open. There's no network segmentation. They're able to move from system to system and be able to gain control over all of those assets. And let's say they do steal that information, right? That's a high impact to the organization, right? That's the worst of the worst. Our secret proprietary information that the entire business is built around. If that was stolen, we might as well start closing our doors. Now, the one thing we hadn't talked about yet was, well, what's the probability of this happening? Like, what's the chance that a nation state attacker is going to be able to break into the IT environment to then move into the OT environment to take control over all of those assets in the OT environment to the degree that they're able to reverse engineer our proprietary formula? Probably 1 in a billion, or let's say maybe 1 in a million. So again, there's this probability. What's the chance that an attacker is going to be able to do this thing, this scenario that we're talking about? And again, then it ultimately comes down to, well, what's the impact? Or if it was the Trisis incident, there's this potential that the nation state attacker could cause some type of explosion at that petrochemical facility in the Middle East. In the scenario we were just talking about, the nation state attackers, they don't want to blow something up. They just want to steal your proprietary information. But when we have the threats, those entities that mean to do us harm, and we have those vulnerabilities or the weaknesses that those threats are going to use, in this case, to gain access to our environment to meet their objectives. Well, what's the chance of that happening? And we want to make that as realistic as possible, which isn't as always as easy as today in OT as it is in IT. And this was very hard in IT 20 years ago because we didn't have a lot of data. Now in IT, we have a lot of data to be able to make these types of metrics come to life. That's, again, not necessarily the case in OT because we don't have as many events or incidents in OT. And if they are occurring, we're not hearing about all of them. They're not being publicly made. Again, it's very much like IT was 20 years ago. So this is changing, but it's slow to change. But we want to make sure when we're trying to determine what the probability of this type of attack occurring is, we want to try to make it as realistic as possible using real world data. And again, there's that impact. So if this happens, right? If this scenario happens that we're talking about, how bad is it going to be? What's the worst case scenario? Now, the worst case scenario, keep in mind, also might not be the most realistic impact. So you want to keep both in mind. What's the worst, absolute worst case scenario versus what's the realistic case that could actually happen? And we're going to talk about some examples. So risk, threat, vulnerability, probability, and impact, right? That's the formula we'll start with. And here we're just going back over those. So I think we've covered all of these, right? Again, probability we want to keep as realistic as possible. Sometimes, and this is where we get into that conversation of qualitative versus quantitative numbers. Right? Quantitative is where we have hard actual facts, where we can use those metrics to say, oh, yes, the average cost of an OT cybersecurity breach in a average size power plant environment cost $15 million, period. Oh, okay, that's nice. And that's a made up metric, of course. But to be able to use that and say it with such confidence because we know the cost of other incidents at other power plants. It's as factual as we can get. It's very quantitative. Qualitative is this idea where it's like, well, it's $15 million because that's what Mike's gut is telling him. Right? Qualitative is usually, yeah, it's just kind of we're going by our gut instinct, which sometimes can be right and sometimes can be very, very wrong. So we have to be careful. And then the impact again. We always, especially when we're doing risk assessments like in ISA IEC 62443, you do want to talk about what is the worst case scenario that could happen. And at the same time, well, what's the most realistic scenario that's going to happen? Is it that realistic that a nation state attacker is going to come into the environment to take over it to cause an explosion? No. That could be the worst case scenario. But the more realistic scenario, that'd be, well, the IT environment gets infected with ransomware and it has an impact to the OT network and the OT network shuts down. That's a more realistic scenario. But we have to explore both and usually everything in between. So I mentioned earlier, a big part of when we're talking about looking at risk is the ability to communicate that to the business. Because this is, again, where we're going to get budget, if anything. We need resources. We need money. We need people. We need time to be able to do the things we believe we need to do to help mature the cybersecurity program in the environment. And I mentioned earlier, and you'll hear me say this a lot, if you haven't already, especially in this course. Every IT environment, they're roughly the same, right? It doesn't. Some are larger, some are smaller, but they're all kind of roughly the same. Every OT environment can be very different. So every ICS, every OT environment you go to can be very different. It's going to have its own unique needs as well. And every business that's wrapped around that OT environment is also typically going to be very different. So we have to help them understand, right, what is the impact to the business if, and this is where it goes back. The most common scenario we talk about when doing a risk assessment is the plant going down. What happens if your environment goes down for 24 hours? That's a good number to know. So if the environment goes down for 24 hours, what is it going to cost? $10 million, let's say. Now, to a very large company, $10 million a day might actually not be a lot of money. I know that sounds strange. It still sounds very strange to me saying that. Whereas losing $10,000 a day would sound like the end of the world to smaller environments. So a big part of this is that economies of scale. It depends on the size of the business primarily. Because, yeah, $10,000 is a lot to lose one day for some organizations, whereas it's pennies to other larger organizations. And they're not going to necessarily worry about risk that could cost them $10,000 a day. It's just not worth it to them, worth it to those larger organizations. And so there are common questions, though, that come up when the business is asking their cybersecurity teams, like how well are we doing, right? They want a thumbs up or a thumbs down. We talk about something bad happening or the risk and the threats and the probability of that risk being realized, of something bad happening, and how much is it going to cost us? Of course, then the follow-up is, well, how much is it going to cost us to fix it, right? To prevent that from happening. If it's going to cost me $10 million to fix an issue that's only going to cost me $10,000, I'm not going to fix it. I'm going to take the chance, I'm going to gamble that that risk is not realized. And we'll come back and have a couple more examples of that. And you can see another question that is very common. And I learned this when I don't remember the first time I heard this, but it was the first time when you start. Oh, this is probably my first full IT cybersecurity job, and I actually worked not directly for, but I had a lot of direct conversations with the CEO and the owner of the company. And he would always ask, well, how are we doing compared to our competitors? Or he would, of course, he would name company XYZ. And every other company I've gone to where I've had conversations with the executive leadership, they're always asking, well, how do we compare to the others in our field? How do we compare to our competitors? Because it can help us gauge, it can help the executives gauge, not only are we spending enough on cybersecurity, but also, I know might cringe to think about, but are we spending too much on cybersecurity? Because that's another way to look at it. And it's important when you think from the business perspective, if you're the CEO or the CFO or in another executive leadership position, you have to make sure that you're spending and investing the company's resources wisely. And if you're spending too much on cybersecurity, you're not doing that. And I know that sounds strange to say as cybersecurity professionals. But again, we're not talking about cybersecurity professionals here. We're talking about the company executives, where they're worried about the company generating a profit, right? Bringing in money. And then they're also worried about, well, how is money going out? And these days, who gets in trouble if something bad happens? But those are just some of the things to think about. We want to make sure, though, that we're investing appropriately. And this is where things like risk assessments can come in and play, and maturity assessments, right? We can look at the environment. And this is in IT as well as ICS OT, right? Come in, look at different aspects of the environment and see how well we're doing in these different types of environments. See where the risk is, and then determine where, based off of all that information, where we need to invest money. And ideally come up with a prioritized list. So where do we need to start first? And what do we need to do next? And then next, and next from there. So you have that laid out roadmap for at least the next year, if not the next 2 or 3. So the strategic roadmap that we're going to build. And we can update it from time to time. We also need to build it so we have an action plan that we can move forward on. So why not at least be moving forward rather than sitting around doing nothing? Because that's not going to help. All right. So I mentioned earlier and talk some about the IT vulnerability management process. I think it's great information to have. It makes a solid foundation of understanding how vulnerability management in general works, how it works in IT, and then how we start to, I don't know if translates the right word, but to then learn how vulnerability management works in OT. So we're going to take some of these things from IT, and then we're going to move them, if you want, over to OT to use. But at the same time, okay, very different between IT and OT. Because in IT, you see, we start usually with scan. Right? I have a vulnerability scanner like Nessus. I've been a huge Nessus user since it first came out. I remember when it first was announced, and I thought this was the coolest thing. One of the reasons why I learned Linux, because it only ran on Linux. So I had to run Linux to get Nessus up and running, to then be able to go ahead and run vulnerability scans. And that's where we're right, generating packets to put out on the network to hit different hosts and different services to then gain additional information about those hosts and the services to determine if they have any vulnerabilities, if they have any weaknesses that an attacker could use to gain access to the machine. And then I would take that information and maybe I have a list of 100 issues. Like, oh, okay, well, I have 100 issues. Well, what we want to do is we need to prioritize those issues. And we're going to do that by assigning risk to each of those issues. And we're going to come back and talk about that. But at a high level, right, we're going to assign them based off of, quote unquote, how bad they are, a priority of low, medium, high, or critical, with critical being the risk, the highest level of risk. Which means if here's a vulnerability that's really easy to exploit and it would give the attacker full control over the system, that's critical. So the idea is that we can use that risk rating to prioritize our work. We can say, get the critical ratings fixed first. The lows, put them at the bottom of the list. You might not ever get to the lows. A lot of environments never do. Probably a lot don't ever get to the medium risk vulnerabilities either. So we typically tend to focus on those criticals and those highs and get to mediums and lows when time permits. But we remediate them. And usually based off of that risk level, there's also some type of service level agreement. An organization is going to have some type of SLA or timeline or guidelines in which you're required to address those issues. So a lot of organizations might say you have 48 hours to address a critical risk vulnerability, right? It's the worst of the worst. We need to jump on it right away. You might have 2 weeks to address a high risk vulnerability. So it's still bad, but it's not as bad as those criticals. And then mediums typically will drop off to 1 month, maybe more. Lows could be like 3 months, 90 days. The nice thing with that prioritized approach to vulnerability management is that it allows the teams that are responsible for doing the remediating the vulnerabilities to fix the issues. It allows them to understand what they need to do and the time in which to do it so they can build that work into everything else they have going on. Because they already have full-time jobs. The last thing they want is somebody from the security team bringing them a list of 100 vulnerabilities to fix in the next 48 hours. So a big part of vulnerability management, even though we don't necessarily talk about it here, is working with those teams and help and kind of understand where they're coming from. Put yourself in their shoes. But going back to our screen, so we scan for vulnerabilities, we assign risk levels to those vulnerabilities so we can prioritize which ones we're going to fix first. Then we're going to work with the appropriate owners of those vulnerabilities to get them fixed. And then once they believe they have them fixed, we're going to rescan. We're going to verify that the work that they did, or they think they did, right, remediated the issue. I say a lot of times you find people think they fixed an issue, but they didn't. So then you need to go back and maybe have a conversation with them and help them understand what might be missing in their steps. So that's the kind of four main parts to vulnerability management. Now you can see at top we have asset management, which we were talking about in the last part of the series. Talking about we want to have that inventory of all of our assets in the environment. So if anything, we know, yeah, all of our IP addresses and we're scanning all of our IP ranges. So we find all of the hosts in the environment. Great. And that we also want to be monitoring for new vulnerabilities. And in part, you can do that through things like vulnerability scanners and making sure that they're up to date on their signatures and you're updating those every 24 hours. So you are always with the latest and greatest. But you also want to make sure you're keeping an eye out on the news feeds, right? And sites like Bleeping Computer to understand what's going on out there in the world. Because if there is some type of vulnerability and it's actively being exploited, and that type of system is in your environment, meaning you probably have that vulnerability in your environment. If you're not watching the news and you're just waiting for a vulnerability scan to find those issues, it's going to be too late. So you have to always be monitoring for new vulnerabilities and listening to the cybersecurity news to understand what's going on, out there in the real world. And don't just isolate within the walls of your organization because you're going to get hit if you do. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. A couple other things to kind of or to think in mind, right? Is we talk about in IT, right? We're looking for vulnerabilities, and by default, you're usually finding vulnerabilities in operating systems, and most of those are just due to missing patches, right? We're missing the latest Microsoft Patch Tuesday release. Or applications that are installed on top of the operating system, a lot of times those get forgotten about. Maybe somebody installs an application, and not only does that application, I'm trying to remember, there was a PLC engineering application that I was just, what's the name of it? That I was just using. And not only do you install it, right, and it could have vulnerabilities over time, but it also installs Java on your machine. And you have to make sure that Java is also updated over time because it could have vulnerabilities. Another gotcha we see in IT is, well, what if there's websites? And this is going to be one of those that we want to make sure that translates to OT because you can have websites in an OT environment where we didn't realize there were web servers with web pages running. And yet there are web servers running in OT environments on things like HMIs or maybe even newer PLCs or other types of devices, even RTUs. And those web servers have vulnerabilities, and those web pages running on those web servers have vulnerabilities. So we have to make sure that we pull those into our testing plans as well. And there are great tools out there for testing web applications. Burp Suite's the number one that's used by all the pen testers out there. And it's about $400 a year for the license, which is relatively speaking, for most people, that's a very affordable tool. OWASP Zap, the Z attack proxy, is kind of like a mini version of Burp Suite. So it's not as functional, but it's free. And so if you don't have a budget, it's a great place to start. Nuclei is another free open source tool that you could use to do testing as well. But usually it's Burp Suite, that's $400 a year. Some open source free tools, or there are lots of other tools out there, but they're going to be much more expensive and probably not as effective as Burp Suite, at least. So vulnerability risk levels, and this is what I was mentioning earlier, that when you get a vulnerability, you want to understand, well, if somebody exploits this vulnerability, if somebody takes advantage of this vulnerability, how bad is it going to be? And how hard is it for them to take advantage of it? Right? With critical, and that worst of the worst means it's very easy to exploit it. And you can do this remotely. You don't even have to be on the machine already with some credentials that maybe you stole somehow. And that once you exploit that vulnerability, you have full control, full administrative control over the machine. Again, that's the worst of the worst. So usually they say that's a level 10 on the CVSS scoring system. You say that range from 9 to 10, right? Anything over a 9, that's the worst of the worst. You want to get that fixed right away. Now you can see high, those are still fairly easy to exploit, but it's going to take probably some technical knowledge. And it's not probably just a free tool that you can download off the internet, like with criticals. And it's going to maybe, like in this case, maybe you do exploit the system successfully, but when you're logged in, you're not logged in as a full administrative account. You're logged in with like a generic user account, or maybe the account that the web service is running as. So it's not as damaging as if the attacker got full control. Right? It's still bad. It's still really bad. And if they're on the machine, it's only a matter of time, realistically, before they get full control. So criticals, we want to get, again, that's usually where I see 24 to 48 hours. Highs, usually 2 weeks, 10 to 14 days. And then we drop off again. With mediums, that's where you see, well, they're very hard to exploit. And in that case, it's almost like there's no exploitation there. And even if they were able to, it's a very, uh, it's very limited. The impact is very limited. So a lot of the medium vulnerabilities you see, whether in IT or OT, it talks about things like weak certificates or maybe an expired certificate on a web service interface. Like, at the end of the day, I know there's discussions about the importance of certificates, but if an attacker is not going to be able to use that vulnerability to gain access, especially administrative access to that host, do I really care in the big picture of things? Probably not. Sometimes these could also be maybe like denial of service attacks. So those are definitely more important or more of concern in the OT world, right? Where we want to make sure everything is up and running 24/7. In the IT world, I'm less concerned about them. Usually in the IT world, if a service went down or a server went down, just restart it. And if it was actually a real attack, well, track down the attacker and prevent it from happening again. But true denial of service attacks are very, very rare. And then you can see low, right? It's almost like, sure, it'd be very, very difficult to exploit, but again, it's another one. If it was exploited, it really wouldn't do anything. So what are we worried about, right? So that's why in most environments, you're always focused on criticals and highs, maybe some mediums, but you typically never get to mediums or definitely probably don't get to any of the lows. And then informational, You see this in a lot of scanners like Nessus, where it just provides you information where it might say like, oh, the name of this host is Engineering Workstation 1 or Data Historian 3. So it's information that's what's great to have for context, and well, it's great information for the attackers to have as well. So it's one of the reasons why, just like the asset register, we have to make sure we protect our vulnerability information. Because if they could find it, they could use it to create that treasure map of how to break into the environment. But that's the idea of these vulnerability risk levels, right? And the associated CVSS score. We could talk 40 hours on just how to calculate a CVSS score for one vulnerability. There's a long, big old formula that they put together to calculate, oh, well, how is it become a 10 or a 4.7 or a 1.8, right? So you can definitely look into that more if you want. So I think at a high level, it's good to understand. Take that base score that you see that the vendor provides it, but do the research, look into why they actually categorized it, and then you're going to tweak it slightly for your environment. We do this a lot at Floor. There are some vulnerabilities that we actually will adjust higher than lower sometimes. So if I know there's a particular item like an auditor is looking for, we'll make it a higher risk just simply because we can't afford to have it appear in another audit report. That's true. If you haven't seen what a vulnerability scanner looks like, or at least the report in a vulnerability scanner, here's at a high level overview. And this was just scanning my home network using Nessus. And then you can see the very one, the 10.2.1.1. That's actually the Wi-Fi router for my house. So you can see it actually has 3 critical red vulnerabilities. Then it has 5 of the high risk vulnerabilities. I think yellow is medium. I don't think it actually has any lows, and then 41 informational notes. So it looks like there's 3 vulnerabilities on my home Wi-Fi router that I could use to take administrative control over it. Well, that's not good. And then you can see there's this other host at 252 that has a high risk vulnerability. Well, that's not great. That would be something we want to look at. And then you can see there's 5, 6 other hosts that just have informational notes, but they didn't find any glaringly obvious vulnerabilities. But that's the idea. You run a scan, in this case, a subnet. The scanner puts out all these packets on the network, first finding the hosts that are there, and then looking at each of those hosts, finding what ports are open on each of the systems, and then finding the services or applications running on those ports. And then finding things like the version, the vendor of those applications and services, and then trying to figure, are there vulnerabilities in these applications and these pieces of services, or maybe some misconfigurations also that can be vulnerabilities. And then you get a kind of nice little view like this to understand, oh, okay, I have like 8 machines in the environment. 6 of them look good, but 2 of them have vulnerabilities I need to take care of. And 10.2.1.1 looks really bad, so I better get on that. But in this case, I can't do anything about it because it's my ISP device. But I could go in and look at that information, right? And this is again, this is a Nessus report. And most vulnerability scanners give you kind of this idea where it's like, oh, okay, if I see, oh, I guess the critical or the highs were the reds. I think that's right, critical is purple. So we don't have any criticals here, sorry. So we have 3 high risk vulnerabilities. And it's saying, oh, hey, we found this MikroTik router. It's running the router OS. And the version that we found is under these others, which means it's vulnerable to these types of attacks. Well, what types of attacks? And then you get some more information. So we see things like relative path traversal, which is a web-based application attack. And then it looks like some type of upgrading trick that you can run to potentially go ahead and see. Ultimately, you could potentially get it to reset the system's usernames and passwords. I'm like, okay, well, if I could reset the password for the administrator account, yeah, that sounds like a pretty bad vulnerability. So that's where we like to do those scans and get the details and the information and understand. And for me, I might say, yeah, like, I want to treat that as critical, or maybe I'll treat it as a medium, right? We're going to make those adjustments depending on our organization's risk tolerance or risk threshold. Again, that's going to come from the business, like we started to talk about earlier. It's not going to come from the cybersecurity team, whether it's an IT or OT. Right? Mike Holcomb, cybersecurity professional, doesn't make those decisions. The business does. The business determines how much risk they're willing to take. And here's some more information you can see like in a Nessus report, right? Where you can see, oh, again, here's high. It's the ID there, the 130432. That's the number of the Nessus, the vulnerability check that it has. So you can see they have it's well over 150,000 these days. Right, the version of the check is something that you can check for remotely when it was first published, when they updated the signature. The VPR, that's a special scoring system that Nessus has. So it's like CVSS, but they try to make it a little bit more realistic for people. And then more vulnerability information. So we talked about it, and I think you already got an idea of this at a high level. But if you want to dig more into it, vulnerabilities, when they're found, they're actually, at least in the United States, right? And different countries do this differently. But in the United States, there's a new vulnerability found, it gets published in this big catalog or database called Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, or CVE. And then they'll actually get a catalog number. And we'll see some examples, but hold on with that. And so you'll see IT, you'll see this also with ICS and OT. And then so you can find those at cve.mitre.org. So our friends at MITRE. Now remember, each of those vulnerabilities that's cataloged in the CVE database, right, should get assigned that CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, right? And that's the 0 to 10 we were talking about earlier, right? How bad is it? If an attacker took advantage of this vulnerability, how bad is it? 9 to 10, right? That's the worst of the worst. That's critical. Or is it maybe high risk, medium risk, low risk, or no risk at all? And they just went through, and this actually probably at the point of recording this, probably 9 months ago, like earlier in 2023, where they just released a new version of the CVSS system to determine, how do they come up with those numbers. So when you look at it, and this is where we start having this conversation about, we get those base numbers, but what does it really mean? And what does it mean to us? Because especially whether it's in IT or, of course, in OT, every environment's different. So if I have a vulnerability, and let's say it says it's a critical risk vulnerability, which means there's a free tool on the internet you can download, and that my grandson or my granddaughter, right, they're 10 and 12, right, they could use it to take full administrative control over this machine, right? That's the worst of the worst. So how bad is that if it's on a Windows system directly exposed to the internet? Yeah, that's the worst of the worst. If it's exposed directly to the internet, it's going to get hacked within probably 30 minutes or less. No ands, ifs, buts about it. So we need to make sure that gets bumped up as high as possible. On the other end of the spectrum, if we had some type of similar vulnerability on a sensor at the lowest level of the Purdue model, while it's not necessarily, right, something we want to ignore, but the chances of an attacker even being in a position to be able to take advantage of it is extremely, extremely low. They're almost always going to have to be there physically. And then even then, how much damage are they going to be able to do? So it's almost impossible for them to get to it, right? They're going to have to be physically on site to even take advantage of it. And then what could they do with it? And we'll come back and we'll talk about things like loss of visibility, which is really what this plays into. So in certain scenarios, it could be bad, but again, we go back to, well, what's the probability of this happening? 1,000,000 to 1, 1,000,000,000 to 1? We have some sites where they're out in the literally, we'd say the middle of nowhere. The further you're out, right, it increases or decreases the chance even further. Doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means the chance of it happening is much less. Well, what about something in between? So what about a data historian running Linux that sits in the IT OT DMZ? Well, now that could be exposed to the IT network or to the OT network. Now, if it was Windows, it probably would have more vulnerabilities. Linux, less some. So we might adjust the vulnerability rating. We might lower it slightly just because it's running Linux. What about an engineering workstation? Maybe we have a laptop that we use to connect to PLCs and make programming updates, right? And it runs Windows 11. Like how do we adjust for that? Probably wouldn't make any adjustments, honestly. So those we want to make sure we get updated. And if it's an engineering workstation, those we're going to update as soon as we can. Because as long as, right, we have extras sitting on a shelf. And then if anything happens with this one that we upgrade, it's like, well, we can go back and downgrade it. And we should have backups to be able to restore and shouldn't have any sensitive information on it. So we should be able just to restore, the OS and the applications and restore from a backup any necessary data. So it wouldn't be the end of the world. Schneider Electric PLC sitting at level 1. And this is where we start to get into some of the more interesting conversations in OT because it's what if even if it was a critical or let's say a high risk vulnerability that could give the attacker control over the PLC. Right, it's at a much lower level according to the Purdue model of the environment. So it's going to take the attacker's time to get to it. So this is where the conversation gets even more convoluted. Because if you have controls like network security monitoring to help you find that type of malicious activity, I would say you could lower the risk because of what we call those compensating controls. So we'll come back and talk more about that. Now, what about a transient Windows tablet used only for maintenance on the plant's isolated Wi-Fi network? Yeah, it's another Wi-Fi or another Windows machine. Update it as soon as you can. If something happens to it, you definitely have replacements. So it shouldn't be the end of the world. And then you're done, right? But the idea is in OT, right, it doesn't translate completely from IT when you look at CVSS scores. But also we have to understand when we look at, well, the vulnerability, well, yeah, we have a vulnerability. Well, what system is it on? What part of the network is it in? Right? What level of the Purdue model? How's an attacker actually going to get to it? If it's so buried deep into the OT network where it's virtually impossible for the attacker to get to it, and that it's not going to present a threat to physical safety, environmental safety, or the operations of the environment, no, we're probably not ever going to do anything about that vulnerability. Probably. But that's where that risk assessment piece comes into play. So when we talk about those vulnerabilities, like we were mentioning earlier, you might get a vulnerability rating based off of that CVSS score from either a scanner like Nessus or, or maybe directly from the vendor. Because remember, in OT, we're typically not actively scanning for vulnerabilities, but we might know based off of our ad set register, we have that Siemens SL 1200 PLC running firmware 3.84, and we can do a lookup to see, oh, it has a vulnerability in it that the vendor has given a risk scoring of 7.2. So we start with that risk rating that we get from either the scanner or the vendor. And then we use that as a starting point for our discussion about what type of action do we need to take? Do we even need to address the vulnerability at all? And that's a big question in OT, because if it doesn't impact safety of people or the general public, of the environment, or the, uh, the availability and uptime of the site, do we care? And in a lot of environments, we probably don't. So there are many vulnerabilities in ICS and OT that go untouched, which is very different than IT. If we do determine that there is an issue and it presents a risk to life, environmental safety, uptime, then there's more conversations to have, right? How soon do we need to get this taken care of, right? What's the chance of this occurring? Because depending on what, how, how high that chance is going to determine, right, how soon we need to get the vulnerability addressed. But then it's a question of how soon can we address the vulnerability in the environment? We might not be able to take the environment down for 6 months. Our next maintenance window might not be for an entire year. So do we even have the option? At the same time, we mentioned this idea of compensating controls earlier. So maybe I can't take the plant down, and maybe I can't address the issue right now. Maybe we can't for another 3 months. But what we could do is apply compensating controls to lower that risk to an acceptable level. So an example I can think of that I always go back to, and we had talked about already previously in the course, is with the Trisis incident. Or one of the big issues with the Trisis incident was that the SIS, their fail-safe backup controllers, were not segmented from the rest of the network. So what if we found that the SIS not only had keys and program mode and they used default passwords, and maybe they had a critical risk vulnerability, but we couldn't take those controllers offline without taking the plant offline, and we couldn't do that for the next 9 months. But we had the option to segment the network to prevent any communication to those SIS controllers. So that would be considered a compensating control that could eliminate or virtually eliminate, maybe 99.99% of the risk associated with those vulnerabilities on the SIS controllers. That's the idea of a compensating control. So we're not fixing the actual vulnerabilities, but in this case, we're applying compensating controls instead of taking the plant down and fixing the actual issues. We're reducing the risk or potentially even eliminating it if the compensating controls provide enough risk reduction. So there's some great resources out there for monitoring for new vulnerabilities. This is where we mentioned earlier, one of your jobs is going to be constantly keeping up on the news and the latest vulnerabilities. Now you can go out and you can subscribe to services like with the Dragos platform or Mandiant to do this for you. But a lot of organizations don't have the money to be able to do that. So you're going to want to do this manually. So you're going to check resources like CISA. That's the clearinghouse, at least in the United States, where you're going to go for vulnerability information, especially in the ICS OT world. Dan Ricci has the ICS advisory project, so I definitely suggest checking out his page, which is strictly for ICS OT advisories, and has a lot of great metrics presented in a lot of great different ways. There's the SANS Internet Storm Center. I like that, especially because of the podcast that they do every day or Monday through Friday. It's only a couple minutes, and they talk about the latest stories and what's going on in cybersecurity, the latest vulnerabilities, and especially those that are being exploited. So if something comes up in the Internet Storm Center, especially in the newscast, it means it's something that you need to pay attention to and see, oh, is this affect our environment? If not, based off of our asset register and our understanding of what's in the environment, that's on a micro-SCADA system. We don't have micro-SCADA systems in the environment. I'm not going to worry about it. And hopefully you don't have them in the environment. Leaving Computer, I think, is a great resource, whether it's for IT or ICS OT, and then the Security Wizardry radar page as well. So also very up to date, keeping you, up to date on all the latest and greatest vulnerabilities. Again, most of it's IT, but they also cover ICS OT. We just don't have as many ICS OT vulnerabilities as there are in IT. Of course, it also brings up that conversation around, or if you're looking at an OT network as a whole, we talk about those traditional ICS OT resources like PLCs and HMIs and RTUs and DCS, but we also have those quote unquote traditional IT resources, the Windows servers and workstations and laptops, and maybe some Linux host in there. So when we're talking about OT vulnerabilities, it includes both sides of the fence. It's OT and IT because we have those traditional IT resources. So don't ignore those. In fact, you have to pay attention to them as much as you do the OT specific type of assets like PLCs and HMIs. So earlier we are talking about, especially in IT, right, we would use a vulnerability scanner like Nessus. And there's others out there like Qualys or Nexpose, but Nessus is the one that I've always used. And Nessus you can use to scan your network, right? Looking for different computers that are out there. It does port scans on each of those systems to find open ports, and then on each of those open ports, it determines what application or service is running on that port. And then it tries to determine are there vulnerabilities associated with that application or service. Now, why we can't just take a Nessus scanner and plug it into the OT network and start scanning is especially in older environments, older devices like controllers, PLCs, and HMIs and RTUs. The older ones, they would receive packets that they didn't understand. They would just choke and die. Sometimes the machine might reboot itself, or sometimes it would crash, or talk about it would even brick. So you physically have to replace the system, the asset. So that alone is a danger in and of itself. Now that's older OT environments. So as we have newer environments with newer assets, they're built to be able to take, right, these unknown network packets, and then, I don't understand this, I'm just going to discard it. I'm just going to ignore it. But there's still that sense of you never know. Plus, we add in the factor in OT, right? Our primary concern is around physical safety. So there's ever a concern of physical safety, and there always should be a very concern of physical safety. Do we want to take a chance that if I have a vulnerability scan and it hits a system and it causes an issue, that it couldn't lead to some condition that kills somebody or at least maims them in some way, shape, or form? Or what about environmental safety? Or what about the site staying up and running? There's always those concerns. So we talk about if there's systems that physical and environmental safety rely on, or the site availability, staying up and running rely on, we're not going to scan those. There's a case to be said, hey, but about data historians, you know what? Safety doesn't rely on data historians, and keeping the site up doesn't rely on data historians. And I have a data historian that runs Windows. You know what? Scan it all you want. Patch it even. because A, again, physical safety, environmental safety, and the availability of the site doesn't rely on the data historian. B, if it did crash, I got another one I can replace it with pretty quickly. It's not the end of the world. So typically, though, active scanning is going to be outlawed, at least for the traditional ICS OT assets in an OT environment. Those higher level of the Purdue model, not necessarily. And we'll come back and talk about that. Or the OT vulnerability management process, right? There's the idea there's some similarities to the IT, but just like we started to lay the groundwork for in the last part, right? It's all about we start with the asset register. Again, every OT environment should have an asset register, just some are more complete than others. But they usually have at least some type of asset register to start with. And then we can look at from a vulnerability management perspective, are we going to do active scanning? Well, probably not. Or if we are, it's on some limited basis where, again, we're only active scanning where there's no chance of physical or environmental safety issues or plant availability issues. Now we can also looking at network traffic to determine vulnerabilities. This can find some things, but it's not going to find everything. So it's one of those where you see it's a safe way to find vulnerabilities. The problem is it doesn't find a significant portion of the vulnerabilities in the environment, right? I talked about as we find those vulnerabilities, whether passively or actively, or by reviewing the asset register and comparing it to vulnerability data that we find at CISA and other sites. Right? We find a vulnerability, then we have to determine what does it mean for us? What do we need to fix the issue? Where is it located in the environment? What's the chance of it being exploited? If it was exploited, how bad is it going to be? Can we apply compensating controls? Can we deploy something to lower the risk? And then just like in IT, if we do fix an issue or we apply compensating controls, we want to verify that the issue was addressed, or at least the compensating controls were put into place correctly. And then we still continue as we would monitoring for new vulnerabilities because vulnerabilities are being discovered every day, not just in the IT world, but also the OT world as well. So I mentioned there's this idea of passively identifying vulnerabilities. And we're not actively scanning, we're not using a tool like Nessus to put out packets on the network. So we're not putting anything out on the network to cause any potential issues. All we're doing is we're sitting there and listening and watching network traffic. Or we put the network interface into promiscuous mode so that way it captures all network traffic going through its interface, whether that traffic is destined for that computer or not. It's going to watch all the traffic that at least it can see. And that we can go back and we can review that information like we did in the last part with Wireshark to see, well, what hosts are out there? And maybe can we identify any ports that are actively talking? Remember, we saw a lot of good information when we looked at the PLCs. Remember, the PLCs that were advertising, they actually not only advertise things like their name and the vendor, but they also advertised their version and their firmware version. So we knew, oh, there's a Siemens SL1200 running firmware version 3.84. So we can go to Siemens or we can go to CISA to see, are there any vulnerabilities in this one specific PLC running this one specific version of firmware? That is OT vulnerability management in a nutshell. Now, a lot of environments can do it manually. Unfortunately, we miss things when we do it manually. There are platforms to help you do this. But then, of course, there's costs associated with that. So it's a little bit of give and take. So it's kind of a hard nut to crack. I don't know how to put it the right way. It can be a challenge, right? OT vulnerability management can definitely be a challenge, especially in smaller environments where you don't have to have a budget, you have to at least start somewhere. So start with your asset register. Start manually checking for things like CISA, for vulnerability announcements, and see if any of your assets that you have in the asset register are known to be vulnerable. And then build from there. And you can do active identification. In a perfect world, we could just sit there and scan the entire network all day long. And the problem is you could cause some type of availability issue with an asset. And then what happens when that asset goes down? Whether it reboots itself, whether it crashes, what if it bricks and you have to physically replace it? And that's why we usually do it pretty unrestricted in IT. Though I've caused a couple of issues in IT environments over the years. And what about then in OT? And that's where we're going to stay away at least from traditional OT assets. Maybe use it at those higher levels of the Purdue model. Now, one of the times where it is generally accepted where you can blast away at IT assets or OT assets is during factory acceptance testing and site acceptance testing, or FAD and SAT. Or sometimes we say the cyber version. So you see CFAD or CSAT. The idea is where we're able to come in and do cyber testing, cybersecurity testing. Factory acceptance testing is actually done at the vendor site. So when they're putting together the specific systems for your site, you're able to go to their factory and test them in the factory before they ever get shipped. And then what happens eventually down the road where they get to the site, but before they've actually, I think, been unboxed and put into the environment. Those are two opportunities where you can sit there and you can blast away with as many active scanning tools as you want because they're not in production. They're not going to break anything. There's no threat to life or the environment or availability because the plant's not up and running. So take the time during FAD and SAT or CFAD and CSAT to do as much active scanning and penetration testing type activities against the assets because it's the only time you're ever going to have that free reign to be able to do it. Because down the road, you're not going to want to do any type of scanning or penetration testing in production environments because we worry about that threat to life and the environment and the uptime of the site. But take advantage of FAD and SAT. Now here's our old Purdue model diagram. And this gives you an idea of where, I guess I should make a note in here. The idea is that this is for consideration. But when we talk about where we're doing active scanning and passive scanning, again, we mentioned in the IT networks, we're almost always doing active scanning using a tool like Nessus. And it's all those traditional IT resources running traditional IT operating systems like Windows. Well, what is that? Right? That's pretty much what we see in the IT OT DMZ. It's pretty much Windows servers. So you know what? Well, why not scan those? Especially if in the patch management server, your malware update service, your data historian, right? The safety isn't related or relying on any of those. The uptime of the environment isn't relying on any of those. And you should have backups to be able to restore any of those in case something bad happens. So you know what? Why not scan that? And same thing with, level 3. It's engineering workstations running Windows 11 and data historians running Windows Server and Active Directory and operation management systems running all Windows. And again, as long as there's no threat to physical safety, environmental safety, or availability, why not? Now, when you get down to level 2, that's where you have a combination of IT and OT resources. So you could say, hey, I'm going to scan traditional IT resources like anything running Windows, like an engineering workstation at least, and a data historian versus maybe the HMI and the SCADA. Even if the HMI is running Windows, we're not going to scan it actively. And we're almost not going to actively scan any of those lower levels either. That's where we're going to rely on things like either passive scanning or we're going to rely on our asset register to be able to determine if there's vulnerabilities in these different types of systems. But only after careful consideration. And again, this is only done with authorization and only when there's without a shadow of a doubt that, again, there's no threat to physical safety, environmental safety, or when we look at the uptime of the facility. So this should come full circle back after the last part that we talked about, right? Is why we have asset registers in the first place. So now hopefully it makes more sense because I need that asset register to tell me which assets I have in the environment and the different properties about those assets, like the vendor and the model and the firmware version, so I can manually look up. If I'm not going to actively scan, I need to manually look up to see, hey, does this Siemens SL 1200 PLC running firmware version 3.84 have a known vulnerability? So that's why asset registers are important. Because vulnerability management in OT environments starts with the asset register. And incident detection also starts with the asset register in OT environments, but we're going to talk about that in the part after next. So I do include patching here for two reasons, because patching, especially when you talk about in the IT world, most vulnerabilities, whether in IT or ICS, right, most vulnerabilities are addressed by upgrading the software, either installing a patch or upgrading to the latest and greatest version of that application. So we go back and we'll just jump back or up ahead when we start talking about patching. This looks just like pretty similar to that Purdue model we were looking at just for where we do active and passive scanning. Because with active patching, right, where we're just patching as quickly as we can, yeah, it's going to happen in IT. And remember, in the IT DMZ, the IT OT DMZ, if those are all, especially like Windows host, and again, safety doesn't rely on them, and operations for an availability perspective doesn't rely on them, you know what? Go ahead and patch. And at level 3, same thing. If safety isn't a factor and availability doesn't rely on those systems, then you know what? Go ahead and patch. And make sure you have a backup plan in case something crashes that you can restore it quick enough. And then maybe have limited patching at level 2 where you still see some of those other traditional Windows assets like the engineering workstation and data historian. And then I would stay away from any of the traditional OT resources like the HMIs and SCADA hosts, PLCs, RTUs, and so on. But it is an option, for sure. But only when you know that it's not going to impact physical safety, environmental safety, or operations. And you're only going to do this with authorization. So we talked a lot about vulnerability management, but then there's this idea where we started talking about threat in the beginning of the section or the part, but then again, we've moved more into vulnerability management. So now we want to come back a full circle and talk about what the threat vulnerability management piece or the threat management piece is. Remember, so we talked about the risk, right? What's the damage that could happen if everything else in that formula comes true, right? The threat, remember, the threat is the source, right? What's coming after us? The attackers that want to try to take advantage of a vulnerability in the system. Now, we started to get a better idea of vulnerabilities, right? And the different risk levels. So how bad is the vulnerability? If it's one of those level 10 critical risk vulnerabilities, the worst of the worst, then that's going to increase the risk, right? Because that would allow the attacker to get into the environment, have full control over that resource. So how bad is the vulnerability? We can start talking about the threats and how much we can start classifying those, like as far as things like skill set, right? Because there's a lot of difference between a advanced nation state attacker versus a script kiddie. They're two ends of the spectrum. Talk about probability. What's the chance of this happening? And if it did happen, how bad would it be? What would be the impact to the environment? Does the OT environment go offline for 24 hours, 72 hours, 3 months? What's the impact? So we're kind of taking a step back and looking at this idea of threat intel. Threat intel, I love for many reasons. Sometimes it can be a love-hate relationship in a way, only because I just sometimes there are a lot of great organizations out there that put out a lot of great threat intel. And they charge a lot of money for it. I get they have to pay for their resources that are doing the job, right? And I don't feel like they're probably overcharging, let's say. It's just the fact that not a lot of organizations can afford to go to a Dragos or a Mandiant or like an IBM X-Force to purchase threat intel information. Right? And again, there's other shops out there as well. Again, nothing against them, right? It's just a lot of our OT organizations, most aren't going to have that type of budget. And that's, I say that's quote unquote okay because you don't need to spend 100 or $200,000 to establish a threat intel program. I had never thought of it, but I had been doing threat intel for years and years before there's this concept of threat intel. Right? I don't have a government background. I got to work with the SEALs for a couple years and the Marines and the Navy and other capacities, but I've never worked in a formal threat intel environment. What I'm really talking about though, threat intel, whether you're talking from the military perspective or like a general perspective, it's we're taking news about what's going on in the real world, what's happening. We're determining if it applies to us in our environments. And if it applies to us in our environments in any way, shape, or form, then we should be taking action on it. That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. So again, I don't need $100,000 or $200,000 Intel program to be able to watch what's going on and determine if it's applicable to my environment. Again, this is just to get started. If you work in a more mature organization, knock yourself out, right? And you have the budget to be able to build these expensive threat intel programs. They're great. They're awesome. We spend at my day job, we spend over $100,000 a year on threat intel because yeah, there is a benefit. But again, not all organizations can afford that cost. We talk about where threat intel comes from. So they talk about a lot of these organizations that put threat intel together. So they talk about, so there's open source intelligence gathering, right? Using free resources out on the internet to gather information, things like Google, or when security companies publish information about different security events. So when Dragos publishes anything, when Mandiant publishes anything, I'm there, I'm reading, I'm taking it all in. But also, what about general news sources, especially those that your executives are looking at, like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal? Because every once in a while, there are cybersecurity stories, and sometimes there's front page cybersecurity stories on there. So not only do you need to know about those and how they affect your environment, but you also have to be prepared for those questions from those executives because they'll be calling. Say, hey, are we protected against this? What does this mean for us? There's this a lot of talk around dark web collection. I'm not a big fan of. I never want to pay for dark web collection. A lot of this is smoke and mirrors because no entity is going to have access to even a significant portion of the dark web. It's just not possible. So how much information are they really getting you and how much useful is it? Unless it's one of those top tier providers that works with intelligence entities like the NSA, these are almost worthless. They're just going to tell you that you have some employees that had email addresses and passwords that were compromised in the latest breach at company XYZ. Whoopee. Right? There's different threat intel feeds. Now there's some that you can get for free, like through SANS, the SANS Internet Storm Center list the number. There's others you can go out and look for. We'll mention a few. And then of course there's ones you can pay for. Through incident response, so maybe you have an incident. And as you're going through that, you're building those indicators of compromise, those signs of how the attacker got into the environment, what IP addresses are they coming from, which IP addresses are they going to, what domain names are they using, right? Those all become pieces of intelligence. Now, the problem is most people, they gather that information when they're doing response in their environment and they don't share it. So that allows the attackers to go and hit somebody else. But if we share that information, then that can help those other organizations identify and protect against these attackers. So something to consider. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. There's also talking about, bringing in this data, right? We have to process it. And there's ideas that we bring in all of this data to really make it intel. We have to have humans, right? Or probably AI these days, right? But we go through a process to determine what's applicable to our environment. And that's really where we have to put in the context. And we'll come back and talk through an example. Look at the context and how it applies to our environment. Now, there's also this idea of attribution, right? Naming the attackers. And we know it's Sandworm from Russia, right? That turned off the power in the Ukraine. Right? We always want to name the attackers. And that's why I always have this love-hate relationship. Because I always, I grew up watching James Bond and, love all things spy. And so it's really cool when you see these attribution stories. It's really fascinating to see. From a cybersecurity defender, though, I almost never care because for me, there's an attacker in the environment. I just want them off and gone. Though really any cybersecurity professional, it should be I think a good balance of the two. You kind of should want some of the spy aspect. In this geopolitically charged world today, I don't think we can get away from it anymore in 2024 or beyond. We're definitely never going back, right? So there's this idea of attribution. And if you know you are actively targeted by, let's say, a nation state, that if you ever hear about that nation state targeting other environments like yours, that better pay attention and start asking those questions like, are we protected against this type of attack if they came after us and not just this other environment? And then again, Intel usually comes out with things like these reports that, again, I love reading Intel reports, the ones that get publicly made by companies like Dragos and Mandiant. You can see threat actor profiles, right? This is where Dragos does a lot of their work, especially in the year in review report, where they come up with all the vendors, right? They'll come up with their funky names for all of the different attack groups and give you information about those attack groups, where they're coming from, what their tactics, techniques, and procedures are, like we see along with the MITRE framework mappings, right? See how do they break into the environments? What are they doing when they break into the environments? Are they taking advantage of any specific vulnerabilities? And then again, those indicators of compromise, things like IP addresses or domain names, those signs, those pieces of evidence or artifacts that we can use that, if you see activity with this IP address in your environment, it could mean you have this attacker in your environment. So you need to investigate. So a lot of this ties in, right, to your incident detection and response program. Now, the diamond model is one way where we can start to kind of build out this idea of understanding not only an adversary, but that additional context that I was talking about earlier. So, how do we know if, even if it's just a news story we hear about in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, how do we know it applies to our environment? So, the diamond model, let's just say at a high level, right? We can take a story of what's happened in an incident, right? We can understand the adversary and aspects of the adversary, like the amount of resources that they have, the skill set of the attackers, the tactics, the techniques, the procedures, right? What they're doing to break into environment, how they break into environment, what do they do once they break into the environment, what seems to be their ultimate goal. Right? That's all pieces of information we want to know. And usually there's could be attribution there as well. It's China, it's Russia, it's the United States. You talk about infrastructure, so that gets over to kind of those IOCs that we were talking about. Some, right? So we're talking about things like IP addresses and domain names, right? The different systems that they're using to attack us. Okay, we get more into the capabilities, and that's of course their skill sets and tactics, techniques, and procedure. Again, there's a lot of overlap, I guess. I know they separate them out. For me, it kind of blur them together, obviously, because that's how I explain it. And then the victim, whether it's one or it's maybe a certain type of victim. Maybe this is an adversary that only targets wind farms. That's kind of specific. Or you can even make it more specific if they are targeting only wind farms in specific geographic locations, like maybe only wind farms in Canada, right? Which is interesting. So then I can look at reports and intel in the story that the diamond model tells us about these victims running wind farms in Canada. But oh, if I run a wind farm in the United States, well, you know what? I should still be paying attention and make sure, hey, are we protected against these types of attacks? And even if I don't have a wind farm or I'm in Canada, there still might be some aspects of that attack that I should be aware of and know, hey, are we protected against this? But that's the Mike Holcomb view of the diamond model in 30 seconds or less. And then that's the breakdown. Again, what are we trying to do with threat intel? And this is where we started to touch on a little bit, right? We could feed things like indicators of compromise into our incident detection and response. We can use this information very heavily when we do risk assessment. So before I do any ISA 62443 risk assessment, the first thing we do is an hour-long discussion on the cybersecurity threat landscape in OT and specific to that environment. So whether it's a power plant or a LNG facility or a commuter rail or a manufacturing site, we want to talk about the latest attacks, at least over the last couple of years, that are specific not only just to OT, but those types of sites. So if I'm going in to do a risk assessment, and I'll do the same also for incident or for uh, incident response tabletops, let's look at all the stories through the intel feeds and the news that we can get to actually then talk about the stories specific to, oh, the attacks in commuter rail for the last 3 years. And I'll tell you, when I did this, I was actually using multiple paid for intel providers and Google, and I was finding stories that were just important in Google that weren't highlighted in these other paid platforms, believe it or not. And I was really surprised, honestly, because there were some really fascinating stories about cyber attacks in rail, especially in Europe, that I couldn't find in those other platforms. It was really amazing. I was shocked. And we'll also talk about information sharing and collaboration, or that kind of falls in line with these conversations around ISACs that we're going to get to. So we mentioned this idea of indicators of compromise earlier, or things like IP addresses or domain names or file hashes, right? The idea is that you have this sign or evidence that an attacker was using this IP address or this domain name or maybe this specific malicious file with this one specific file hash. So if you find this somewhere else in the environment, it means the attacker is probably there as well. Or if someone at another company or entity sees activity associated with these indicators of compromise, it does exactly that. It indicates that there's potentially a compromise. And we're going to come back and talk about that more in the part for incident detection, but I think you get the idea for now. So we started this idea again, and you don't have to go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to build out a threat intel program. You can start small and build from there. We talk about defining objectives and scopes. Really, at the end of the day, for me, it's, hey, I want to know about cyber attacks out in the real world that are occurring and be able to determine if there's essentially lessons learned for me for our environment to find out, right? Are we vulnerable to this type of attack that we hear about in the news? And if so, what can we do to protect ourselves against it? So we have to collect that data, whether it's just reading the news, if we don't have any money to buy access to an Intel platform, maybe I'm just watching Bleeping Computer and the New York Times and the latest Google News feed. And then I'm reading those, right? I'm analyzing, fancy word for, yes, reading and determining, right? Does this relate to our environment? Yes or no? No? Okay, don't care about it. Yes? Then let me dissect it a little bit further. Right, there's things like threat indicators, which includes things like indicators of compromise, IP addresses, domain names, file hashes. Right, you're not going to find those things typically in like a Bleeping Computer or a New York Times article, but they might exist in some other techie news sources. Well, as we're going through that, right, we're going to do that risk assessment. Does this apply to us? Oh, if it does, well, how bad could this be in our environment? Which helps us then determine how quickly do we need to take action on this? It's kind of like, prioritizing the vulnerabilities, right? How quickly do we need to get this fixed? And kind of like we did back then, can we apply compensating controls to either eliminate or at least lower the risk to an acceptable threshold, right? Determine what the action plan is, and then make sure we take action to fix the issue, or again, to at least lower the risk as much as possible, and then improve over time. And we're talking about, in this case, improving the program over time, which can include information sharing. Because like we mentioned earlier, if you have indicators of compromise, but you're not sharing those with anybody, you're not helping anybody else out. So the attackers are just going to be able to get away with what they're doing over and over and over again. So that's the importance of why things like ISACs and other threat intel programs, and yes, even including the ones that you pay lots of money for, they are important because it does hinder and it does stop the attackers for those that have a threat intel program. So we mentioned for small, medium-sized environments, you probably don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to go out and buy threat intel sources to build into your program. And that's okay. But start with monitoring those news feeds. Bleeping Computer. Again, if there's one I had to monitor, it would probably be Bleeping Computer these days. Determine, are they relevant to you? Yes? Then, if this happened to you, how bad would it be? What do you need to do to stop it? Develop that plan and take action. One of the things, and this is, I started at Floor, was creating a daily news feed internally for everybody in cybersecurity and others that were interested. and key stakeholders, where they would get an email every day with all the highlights from all these free resources out there, like Bleeping Computer and the Sans Internet Storage Center. And those are two on there. And then we have a couple others that we use, like Wired Magazine, so Wired.com. So whenever there's a relevant news story that comes out, they'll get it in this daily list of websites or articles to check out. And then my boss took it to the next degree and kind of created a version just for executives. So I report to our CISO. So he created one just for basically our CIO, our CEO, and maybe some other C-level executives. And he doesn't, we might have in our version like 12, 13 stories a day. In his, he has probably like 2 stories a week because what's going to be applicable and of interest to the executives at that level. It's much different than what's important and of interest to us at other levels of the organization that are more in those operational roles trying to protect the organization. Now, if you ever find, and the second from the bottom, item is really important because if you're finding items that you need to address over time, it's best to make sure that you are tracking these, even if it's just an Excel spreadsheet, but you have somewhere where you're tracking these items so that way you can always go back and make sure you're improving over time. You don't want to realize that, oh, you had this vulnerability or this issue that you knew about a month ago or a year ago, and then all of a sudden there's a hacker in your environment, and because they took advantage of that hole and you just never fixed it. So make sure you're logging and tracking these issues over time and making progress to fix them. And then you can also use ISACs, which we're going to talk about in a second. So an ISAC is a group that you would go to, usually for your industry that you're most aligned with. And then you would share your information with them about your attacks, and then they would share everybody else in that ISAC shares their information with you. We'll come back and talk about this for a second, but some of those other news feeds or sites that you can watch for, like I mentioned, Dragos, Mandiant, anything that Mandiant's going to write about OT, anything Dragos especially is going to be writing about OT, I'm going to be reading. Bleeping Computer, which I think to me is the best news for OT and IT these days. The Internet Storm Center at SANS, and then CISA. CISA, it kind of is just that clearinghouse for vulnerability announcements and some stories when they come out, it's usually like most of us are like, oh, that's a little bit too late. It's for folks that, aren't trying to stay on top of this. So hopefully everybody here is working on staying top of everything. So CISA is a great place to start, but hopefully you'll get to a place, in your experience in your career where you're like, yeah, then you just released this announcement. We knew we should have done that like 2 years ago. Duh. Right? That's typically what a lot of the CISA stuff does. And that's nothing against CISA, and I don't mean it to be, because they do a great job and they get a lot of great information out, right? For everybody else that they have no security program. So CISA is a great place to start, but hopefully you get to a point where you're like, CISA is not going to offer me much, right? And that's the way we want it to be. CISA has its place, but we want you to move past, needing kind of the CISA generic, disclaimers. Like there was one, well, it was like a month or two ago talking about the HMIs that were being hacked by the cyber avengers from Iran. And they were being hacked because nobody was changing the default passwords, which was 1111. So there was a big, I think, CISA, advisory about changing default passwords on HMI. So yeah, if you're new to the industry, you're new to cybersecurity, you might not have known, hey, oh, it's important to change default passwords. That's why I was just meaning, because then eventually, as you move forward in your career and your experience and knowledge, you'll know we want to make sure we don't leverage things like default passwords on our systems, whether it's in IT or OT. So that's the idea that I was trying to communicate there. But those are some great free resources that you can use. Again, if anything, I read anything that Dragos puts out. If Mandia puts out something in the ICS OT world, I'll read it. They actually do a really good job there as well. Again, and then pay attention to the others. So kind of taking a step back, I wanted to look at some examples of, we talk about building out threat intel that we can use. This story is about, I think this is mid 2023, and this is where you could see, and this is of course as I think after a year already of the latest Russia invasion of Ukraine, but you can see where that Russia was using these fake campaigns to target different diplomats in Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine. And so it's an example of, well, if I'm a diplomat or if I'm in charge of security for diplomats, especially in Kiev, then we need to be worried about these types of scams and make sure all the diplomats and their assistants and the teams that work with them understand that these types of scams exist. Of course, it could also be used against other diplomats, just not besides the ones in Kiev. So anyone who's a diplomat or works with a diplomat or the security teams for diplomats should also take this into consideration. So it's one where it's great when you can get as specific as possible as far as foreign diplomats in Kiev, but at the same time, yeah, it can also apply to other diplomats as well, or and maybe not this specific type of attack, but variations of this type of attack. So it's one of those types of attacks that we understand exist. It targets diplomats in that we should be aware. And it probably could apply to many people, just in general, right? But so we can take that though in kind of in the OT world, right? Bring it out a little bit further. So this is where we talk about the Port of Nagoya attack, where the IT environment essentially burned down to the ground from ransomware to where, of course, it brought down communications, especially for the communications that would be used to coordinate moving around the shipping containers. And without that communication, you can't move shipping containers and the port shuts down. So we had this story. And at the same time, several weeks goes, or um, in the past, right, there's this idea that I think this was the port of Houston, which is the largest port in the United States based off of the size or the amount of the I guess the freight that is transferred through the port. So prior to you can see the port of Nagoya, right? Prior to that, we actually had an instance where I think it was like 2 years that there was a breach in the IT side of the port of Houston. So if I work at any port in the world, I see an incident at any other port, especially any other large port, and I want to learn, well, what happened in that incident, right? Are we protected against that? Are we vulnerable? Are we able to detect those types of attacks? Are we able to prevent it? Those are the key questions that I'm asking. So that's when I talk about cyber threat intel, that's really what I'm looking at. I want to find other news stories about incidents and environments most like mine. And yeah, if you can make it as specific as possible, great, right? Think Port of Nagoya, right, which is in Japan versus Port of Houston, right? It's on the other side of the world, but it's still one of they're some of the largest ports in the world. So I'm going to be watching what's going on in these other large ports in the world, or even probably even the smaller and medium size as well. Right? If ports are being attacked, I want to know about how those attacks are occurring, what's happening, and am I protected against it? And if not, then how can I be protected? Like that's again, that's my approach to cyber intel. I mentioned earlier, you can publish internal newsletters and circulate that to help get information out. It could be part of your kind of your security awareness efforts. Part of OT cybersecurity is awareness. I thought I was getting out of security awareness when I got kind of out of traditional IT cybersecurity, but really I do more awareness efforts now in OT cybersecurity than I did previously. And part of that is making sure that like our clients understand when there's specific incidents that impact them, right? Just like we were saying, if I had a customer that's a one of the world's largest ports, I want to make sure that they're aware of incidents like the one at the Port of Houston a few years ago and the one more recently at Port of Nagoya, so they understand what happened there. And again, are they protected? And if they're not, what do they need to do to protect themselves against those incidents? Right. So that's again, it's one way to share information. Again, this is where we're talking about earlier, though. If you have information about incidents, right, you can choose to keep that to yourself and not share it with anybody. And that was even IT, five up to 5, 10 years ago. We see a lot more open sharing in IT. And in OT, I think they're trying to share sometimes, little by little, but still far behind IT. And I think it's coming. But the idea is whether in IT or in OT, you have the ability through informal sharing versus formal sharing. I think of informal sharing often as kind of different working groups that get together. Like I sit on a few of these where you just kind of get invited to these different groups. They always talk about using Chatham House rules, so you can you can talk about like outside of the group, you can talk about the things you talked about, but you don't name names, right? So like I've sat on these groups with some of the world's largest, manufacturers and port facilities and power plants and oil and gas providers, and so we could talk about the incidents and the information that they shared, except we just don't name where that information came from. And so that's kind of like that's the informal sharing approach. Informal sharing though keeps it's great that you're sharing that information, but it's on a very limited basis. Where formal sharing usually ties in with something like an information or an ISAC, where it's going to allow you kind of a more established framework to provide that information. So we talk about things like here, the energy ISAC. So if you are at a entity that is responsible for power generation or transmission, you can become a member of EISAC or the energy ISAC. So if you have information related to cybersecurity and attack, maybe against your own organization, you can share that with the EISAC, and they can share that information with everyone else in the EISAC. They won't say where it came from unless you wanted to share your company name. Otherwise, they'll anonymize it, but you could send them lists of IP addresses and file hashes if you have them, and domain names that are associated with the attack against your network. So it goes out to all of the members of that ISAC. And so that's where we talk about the information sharing and analysis centers. And you can see that you can join the ISAC. Some are free, some are very expensive, and there's everything in between. And some of the free ones are bad, some of the free ones are really good. Some of the expensive ones are really good or so-so. So it kind of just depends, but find whichever one your organization, your industry, right, is the best fit and join that one if it's something that you can afford. Or maybe it's one like the EISAC where it's free. You just have to be a member of the of an organization that generates or transmits electricity. So you can see, so information sharing, analysis and reporting, they can sometimes help with incident response, coordination, again, making contacts, being able to collaborate with others in your industry, spreading information. There's a lot of great reasons to be a member of an ISAC. I've always heard the financial ISAC is the cream of the crop, even though it probably doesn't apply to most people listening in on this video. when we talk about things like, yeah, ISAC is probably the biggest one, most accepted in the OT world. I don't work in any power generation environments at the moment, so I can't be a member right now. So sad. But but uh, I'm sure that it's only a matter of time before I can join again. So, but there's other ISACs that I can also join. So. So you can see here's a list of some of the common ones that we have out there. And there's like probably what a good 2 dozen in the ICS OT world, but here's some of the ones. So you see there's a general one called the ICS, ISAC. So that's probably the one that everybody can check out. Again, if it's in electricity or energy, you can go EISAC, oil and gas. You can see rail, chemical, water. I think you kind of get the idea how they're broken down, right? Just each kind of sector or industry has their own. So again, there's a lot more out there as well, but so find the ISAC is the best fit for your organization. So now more mature organizations that have money and resources and things like staff to throw at building out a formal Intel program, that's great, and you actually have people that are dedicated to each of these different processes and tasks. So you could have somebody that's responsible for dark web monitoring, again, for however effective that is, even though, or maybe you have somebody that's engaging different vendors that do that monitoring for you and will let you know what specific accounts were found to have compromised passwords. So you could ask those employees to get their passwords reset. Um, Something along those lines. And that's typically what comes out of dark web monitoring for the most part, right? You have somebody performing open source intelligence against your organization. That's a little bit of what we're going to do in the next part. We're mostly focused on the next part in the series about using Shodan to find control systems that are exposed to the internet. You got people specifically monitoring some of those feeds that we've talked about, whether it could also be paid feeds from companies like Dragos or Mandiant or others, or maybe it's ones that they're focused on finding or creating, or even some of the open source ones like through the SANS Internet Storm Center. They're doing their own research as well. They could be do threat hunting, right? That's threat hunting is really an activity that's evolved out over really the last couple of years on the blue defensive side of the house, where we're able to especially look at things like network traffic and look for signs of attackers in the environment, right? We assume compromise, we assume there's an attacker in the environment, and we want to find them. We don't have any sign that says, or any alerts that say there's an attacker in the environment, but we assume that they are. So we're looking for them. So we're going to come back and talk more about this and things like establishing baselines and doing user behavior analysis. That's going to be in the intrusion detection part, which is going to be in, I think, three parts. 3 parts. So that should be part 8, I think. Don't quote me on it though. You can work with security awareness to coordinators, right? The people that run your security awareness programs. Maybe there's information you want to get out to everybody, so you can work with them to give them information that you feel is helpful for everybody in the organization to know about. And then you can actually even have, maybe the bigger the program, you might even have individuals that specifically focus on understanding the threat profile of your organization, but understanding the different threat actors, right, that are coming after your organization. That's a big part of that threat analysis piece. That's partly where the diamond model comes into play. So there's a lot there, but larger organizations that have a mature threat intel program will have individuals that are responsible for these tasks. Maybe it's one person that does all of these things, or 2 or 3, or maybe 10. Of course, it just depends on the size of the organization and depends on the size of the information security team. So food for thought. And at that, that's the end of this part. Again, I don't have my thank you slide, but I appreciate everybody for jumping on the call or onto the watching the video and checking it out. So I'm really excited. So next time we're going to get into, again, using open source intelligence gathering and primarily Shodan defined industrial control assets that are exposed to the internet. And we'll even do some reverse engineering of the NSA Elite Wolf project, which kind of was designed to help find Chinese attackers in U.S. resources. I believe that's the hypothesis. So thanks again for checking out. If you liked the video, if you can like it on YouTube, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I really appreciate it. Otherwise, again, I'll see you back here for the next part when we talk about using particularly Shodan and open source intelligence gathering for ICS OT. All right, thanks again, and I appreciate you for coming and for checking out the video. All right, take care.